Okay, hi everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Hi Mattia, thank you for liking the stream. So today or tonight, whatever it is for you, I will continue my work on Lucius Unmasked. So one of the newly released titled masters from this year's Gen Con. And just to wrap up what I've done so far. So last time I streamed, I started with the cloak. Then I moved on to the elegant vest he's wearing, some white clothes. I did a base coat of red and leather. Also, I painted the mask with red glowy eyes. Then did some inhuman skin tones on his hands, just to make sure he looks less human and more Neverborn. And I also outlined the colors. It's just the base colors on the base. And today I will continue working. I think that within today's stream, I should be able to complete the miniature. I think I will start with his trousers. And I was hesitating how to tackle these parts, but I think that his trousers go a bit lower. Then there is like this leather element here, and the greaves on the shins will be painted golden metal, kind of like to match his mask, but in a bit of a different shade. I will maybe glaze it with some purple or green just to make it stand out a little bit more. But to begin with, I will start with the pants. So again, I will start off with using some dark gray here. So for that, I will start with Basilicanum Gray. Just give a good shake to the color, and I will start applying it just to make sure I have an even coverage on the whole surface. So painting directly from the pot, since this one doesn't have that strong coverage, so I will just test it on a piece of paper they have. So it's very dark gray, not black, and I will spread it over the lower section of the trousers here, just to make sure I cover it above the elements which will be treated with different shade. I think I will also fix some of the transitions here, just to give a dividing line between the leather and red, and spread it a bit more evenly, just using the opportunity to fix any small things that stand out. And while I wait for it to dry, because obviously it doesn't have that strong coverage, so I will need to apply it over this surface at least twice. So while I wait for it to dry, I will actually work on other elements. So I will use some Black Templar and paint his boots. So they will be dark to begin with, but I plan to finish him off using dry pigments. So this will be closer to the end of the stream because I want to get some fairly easy and realistic wear and tear effects. So I will be using paint which has powder consistency. It's basically colored powder, and I will be using a fixing medium to make sure it stays in place. But this will be towards the end of today's stream. Maybe I will also try to use some still water effect just to give a touch of swampiness to the base, because in general the theme for the Neverborn that I have is swamp, so I think I will incorporate some swampy elements on his base as well. Okay, there is the black base coat, and now I will also do the dark brown base coat for the metal elements. As you can see, I've already put it here and there, so the same will go on his legs. So just quick application here, nothing really fancy. I want to have a clear overview of which area to tackle with golden. I think I will leave the metallics for the end, because the thing about painting using metallics, using metallic colors, is that when you clean your brush, and I have just one small pot with water, when you clean your paint with brush, some small particles, just literally minuscule flakes of paint, stay in the water. Well, that is true about all paints, but the metallic ones, they tend to affect other colors that you may use afterwards if you use the same water, and I think it will be just more efficient to keep the same pot of water and do metallics at the end, just to avoid needing to interrupt the stream to get clear water. All right, that's more or less covered. Yeah, and the gray contrast is drying nicely. I will add to it a little bit more. So there will be basilicanum gray here. And again, applying a layer of paint over that. I will then bring it up a little bit and then modify the hue of the color with some blue glazes, just to make sure it stays coherent. Because for now it's just, well, it looks decent already. Like there is some depth here, but I want to bring out the structure of the material a little bit more. And I will also need to bring out the red. But before I do it, I will also use some Gore Granta fur for the leather elements. Okay, there it is. So basically I will, after this just several minutes, I will have a clear overview of what I want to tackle next. Just to have this kind of map of how I want to finish this miniature off. This overview, I like to have main colors blocked on the miniature so that there are no elements which are only base coated, because then I have this very good overview of the general composition, and I can just do a tweak here or there to make sure I keep it organized. So it's already beginning to look better. No white showing through. If you watched the previous stream, you might remember that the vest part was the most time-consuming bit, because there was a lot of this dotting technique where I was just very lightly tapping the surface with gradually increasingly brighter shades of blue mixed with white, just to give the appearance of having some kind of texture. And since now I have this clear overview, I think I can start tweaking it a little bit. So now that I look at it, I will reapply some brown on the leather pouches just to make sure it's a bit darker, because it seems too bright to me at this stage. So I want to gently just let the paint flow over the surface and let the elements absorb another layer of paint, just to make the color a bit richer. It will be a bit darker. It's like a bit like glazing, because you basically reapply the same color to change the depth of the shading. It's not a huge effort, but the results are immediately noticeable. That's it. A little bit on his shoulder pad. He has some leather piece of armor here. And now on his knees a little bit more, because that was a bit too bright in comparison to other leather elements. That brown will still need a bit of work, so I don't even need to clean the brush, because this will keep the gray a bit darker, because it absorbs still the element, a little bit of brown, which is fine, because when the elements are close together, it's going to look more structured again. All right, that's pretty much it. So now that I have this clear overview, I have this brighter section on the upper half of the miniature, darker at the bottom. I will still work on the base, but before I get there, I think that the element that is somewhat in between those two main areas, which is not a focal point, but when you look at it from the side, it becomes quite significant, will be this red rope showing through here. So I will start by bringing it up a little bit, and for that I will use Vallejo Red. It's model error. So this paint, this is actually a neat trick, because this paint has very, very thin consistency. It's literally as if it was watered down, because it's supposed to be ready for use with airbrush. I think you still need to thin it down with medium a little bit if you want to use it with airbrush effectively. And now I will just paint it straight from the pot. I've put it on the palette, but before I put it on the external section, I will just test it on the inside part. And as you can see, it makes the red more vibrant, but it doesn't create that much of a contrast, which is what I want at this point. So I will just gently let it slide over the surface, keeping a line of darker shade in between, just to make sure that I don't apply that result in losing this gradient effect, which I want to have when I'm highlighting. And the trick about highlighting red is that if you mix red with white, it's very easy to make it look pink, which is not necessarily what you want. If you mix it with any other color, it changes completely. So one way of dealing with it is just using different shades of red. So just having a few pots of red paint with dark red, medium red, or you can try mixing it gently with orange or yellow, and if you're careful, you can still keep some red in the colors that you use for highlights. So for that, I think I will use, let me just grab my yellow. I need to there it is. So I'll be using Uriel Yellow, which is a very strong shade. It's got quite good pigment. And I will just grab a little bit of it, put it on the palette next to yellow, next to red, and just dip it in, twirl around a little bit, make sure it still looks more red than orange. And then I will apply it closer to the edge, making sure I just don't cover the entire surface that was covered with the previous highlight. So being really careful here just to make sure I don't go over the whole section, rather just midsection and going to the bottom. One thing to approach it is to look at your miniature from the distance every now and then, set it up against the light and try to visualize how light would reflect off of it. And this should give you some very general idea. Yeah, thanks for all the likes. Great to see more community members, more people on the channel. It's definitely interesting time of year and a good time to be a fan of Wyrd miniatures, as there are new releases. It's this post-Gen Con time where people are anxiously waiting for updates on their orders. It can take a while. There's always a huge number of things coming out, but you'll get yours eventually. May just take some time. Now I'm adding a bit more yellow and just tapping it on the side, not going all the way. As you can see, it creates this kind of pattern of, again, dot-like pattern, because I don't want to have it silky smooth. I don't want him to look like royalty. The idea is that he's this kind of assassin walking in the street. So I think that those elegant manner-like clothes are things that he leaves behind when he goes out in the street to do the dirty work. So there will be a bit more contrast here, but using this dotting technique allows me to kind of imitate texture of material. Okay, that's pretty much it. And now I will continue with the pants. I think that would be the next step to go. So or maybe, yeah, the pants, and I will also tackle the leather elements. Hey, Trick, thank you. Finally, you get to see some guild models, right? Are you going to play this one with your guild? Do you see potential in new Lucius? I'm not sure you played the first version of Lucius much. At least I haven't seen you use him much, so curious to see if you consider putting this one on the table at some point. So now I will be doing an overbrush with my favorite color, one of my favorite colors, Skeleton Bone. As soon as Wyrd sent it. Well, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? I think hopefully you get it soon. So now overbrushing here. And as you can see, if you just lightly let the brush do the work, it's not about going with one quick dry brush. It's like semi-dry. I don't remove the paint completely, just make sure that some of it stays. And then when you just brush it over the surface a few times and allow the paint to collect in one spot more than in the other, you just get this gradient like highlight. And now for the leather elements, I will be very selective, and I will use not the top of the brush, but rather the side of the brush, and just lightly let the brush slide along the edges and along the protruding elements, just to allow it to pick up the details. And this creates a kind of it's a kind of realistic look that you get. If you look at, I think that it's always a good idea to look for reference online. So if you just Google leather, well, of course you may find some weird stuff, but let's say leather armor. And if you make it more specific, you will see some pictures that you can use for reference. It's always a good idea to study them. And I'm not saying that we should aim for realistic look. It's just about understanding how light plays with different types of material, how it reflects different types of material. Could be useful at times. And now brushing over the leather sections again. And now I will use a little bit of light wash or maybe even soft tone, just to make sure that the transitions that the highlights I created with this overbrush will become a bit smoother. So I'll mix some of the soft tone with water and just give it a light glaze. Kind of evens everything, makes it more smooth. So now it's the glazing stage. Being a bit more careful on the belts. Don't want to tint the blue material. While at this point, when it has this very thin consistency, it can be still fixed, but why fixing if you can just be a bit more careful? Maybe a bit more of soft tone added to the mix. So quick question for you, mate. How many boxes did you put in your Wyrd order? Because I know you made one hell of an order. So let's see if anyone can beat you with the number of boxes that you had in your order. I'm betting on at least a dozen. That would be my guess. And for the pants, I will tint them with blue, but going with blue would be maybe a bit too radical. So I will mix blue with brown just to get this slightly more complex shade. I don't want it to be too bluish. I want to have a rugged look. So I will aim for off blue tinted with brown. 2 books, 15 master boxes, 3 side starters, 2 trace boxes, 1 bin. Wow, that's a lot of boxes. That's a lot of boxes. That's impressive. I mean, with them being too shiny, let me show you why I don't worry about it. Just let me pick something up from another section. So I use matte varnish. And the matte varnish that I've been using recently, and I can only praise it, it's amazing. It's Vallejo acrylic matte varnish. You spray it on your painted miniature, and elements that look shiny become matte. And it's crazy because the moment that you spray it, for a moment they look really bad. It takes a while for it to dry, but once it's dry, you get perfectly matte look. Like, let me give you 2 quick examples. Yeah, matte over contrast. So those are the examples of miniatures painted with contrasts. I use contrasts a lot here. As you can see, they don't really have this shine effect. And thanks for popping by, Lizzie, again. Good to see you. Would be interesting to pick your brains about when the cards will make it to the app. I'm not sure if you're at liberty to say it officially. They will be there when they will be there. That's the kind of answer I think you can give at this point. Because once they are out there, the gaming metas everywhere will be turned upside down because people will start using the new titled masters officially. So a lot of people looking forward to do that. Yeah, I understand it's not up to you, but I'm sure it will be. It will be ready when it's ready. Also, we need some time for people to get through the books, to enjoy them, to read through the story, find out everything. But I'm actually glad that Wyrd has formally why bother spoiling the fun? Testing phase. The main work is done. That's great. That's good to know. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing the skeleton horde with the blue-brown glaze that I had. And while the paint is still not completely dry, I will just try to apply a little bit of highlight, just going along the folds of the material, because then the highlights will dry simultaneously with the wash, and combined it should create this nice look of folded material. It's back, no audio. Oh no, that's bad. Can you hear me now? No audio. Let's see. So I will keep on talking and you will kindly let me know when you hear my voice again. Hope it's an easy, quick fix. Hopefully, our amazing hobby assistant Kimberly can fix that. She's usually good with making quick fixes on short notice. So, fingers crossed she can solve it quickly. Worst case scenario, we'll just restart the stream in a second. But let's hope we don't need to go there. Audio back. Right on. Thank you. Thank you, wonderful word assistant. You've done your magic. Good to know we're back. So now I'm playing with his pants a little bit, with playing around with highlights there. It looks super glossy, but the paint is not even dry. I didn't bring the hair dryer. I'll be just waiting for it to dry on its own. So I'm not really rushing here, just taking it step by step. And as it dries, I start again adding those dot-like highlights. Well, the advantage of this technique, rather than going with a gradually thinner lines, is that you create this texture, additional depth. You add additional depth to the texture, because the texture, the folds of the material are very well defined on this miniature. You can clearly see where they start and how they form across the larger surface, but just you get this more, I would say, gritty look when you do it this way, and I think it makes for a bit more dynamic finish that I'm looking for. Rather than going, hopefully you can see it on the edge here. It's just that instead of one clear highlight, you have these dots that, well, seem to me that they add a bit of depth. Anyway, that's how I want to tackle this one. If it gets too clearly visible, just grab the brush, dip it into the original glaze, and spread it on the elements which you think are too bright, and blend them in with the rest. That's why I paint rather fast. I keep all the mixtures on the palette so that I can quickly go back and forth if I need to make adjustments, well, on the fly. So a bit more here. All right. Now I think I will start working on the golden elements, because why not? While I wait for it to dry, or maybe I can actually try to make the browns look a bit more varied by adding a little bit of contrast yellow. So I'll be using Nasdaq yellow for this one. And I will grab a fairly small brush. Make sure that it's damp. Wipe the excess of water, because you don't want to mix water with contrast paint. It tends to separate the pigment and affects it in, well, not the way that you want it to be affected. So if you want it thinner, but way better to just use Lamia medium. So guys, those of you who are listening, I think that next time I have a few miniatures waiting in line for painting. And I'm not sure at this point which one to choose. So I think I will put a poll on either Discord or with forums. But I have some explorers. I have the emissary. I have the whole, pretty much the whole seeker keyword at this point. So the damned Osteria and Twiggy, I think this is the name. So as you can see, what I'm doing now is just leaving a bit of slightly watered down yellow on the brown elements to just bring them up a little bit, make them a bit more visible. And I'm hesitating what to pick next. I still have the Nexus, the new Nexus, one of many, so the 3 creepy kids. I have Kavatika. I have already some guild stuff on the side that I'm working on. So some of the, well, pretty old guild stuff. Mr. Grimwell. And I also have another emissary, the mysterious emissary. So I think I will post a poll, give you guys a few names of miniatures I have, and let you decide what I paint next. Hope that sounds good to you. Unless I hear some clear preference for the next project to work on during the stream. I will add a bit more highlights with a bit brighter shade of off-white. Emmy, but which Emmy? I would assume your vote goes to the Explorers one. And I would assume that's because you haven't painted it yet. And maybe you could paint along. That would be fun. That would be a fun miniature to tackle because it's like this huge walking monument, basically. So I'm not sure how I would approach it, whether I would aim for something like granite or make it look more ancient, try to add some kind of glow to it. I still haven't made up my mind on how I want to approach it. Tend to approach larger miniatures with just an open mind and adjust, well, on the fly, just modify my ideas as I gradually work on the miniature. Don't have a strong feeling about it. Just approach it with open mind and see what the miniature says to me, to put it in a way. So what it communicates, how the initial colors look when I place them, how just the basic base coat and overbrush of white looks like, and then I start getting ideas. That's how I would typically approach it. Your emissary is painted? Oh yes, it is painted. Yeah, now I remember. I was just thinking about this Calypso one that I saw after last tournament. Not the last, but the previous tournament. The Calypso, that's the big metal guy. Yeah, but the emissary is painted. That's very true. That's a massive model. And it's got some nice ornaments, especially on the shield. So this could be fun to work with. But then I'm literally spoiled for choice because pretty much all the miniatures from Seeker keyword are aesthetically, they're just fabulous. The Lamplighters, Mikhail, Sophie. Well, it's not like I'm naming those that I like. I can basically name the whole keyword here, and all the miniatures look amazing there. I was tempted for a good while, to start actually getting into explorers because I like the miniatures so much. But then a friend of mine has asked me to paint his, and that's one way of getting the painting experience, which is something that I really like, and not buying into another faction, which is what my wallet wouldn't like. Because it's easy to commit, and then it's challenging to keep up with both painting and playing a second faction. It's just an effort. You need time and you need commitment. And while I may commit myself to doing that, I won't be able to back it up with suitable amount of time. So I will be sticking to Neverborn for the time being. And there's some new exciting stuff coming for the Neverborn, like the new Dreamer. Aesthetically, the miniature looks amazing. Game-wise, I haven't really studied it much, so I cannot say much. It's not the kind of summoner, supporter, beater, schemer that we have now. It's a different take on the Dreamer. Now placing some highlights on the shoes. And these don't really matter that much because they will be given treatment with dry pigments later on. But I really like Lady Yume miniature, the one that my fellow Wyrd painter Ben from Astrofold Art has been working on in his last streams. That's twisted miniature. And I very much look forward to working on that one as well. I don't think, to be honest, there is a single miniature that I don't like from the new releases. Because I think just that the quality in general is really top-notch. But I like twisted miniatures. I like miniatures which have claws, which have additional limbs or inhuman. They look inhuman because I just like to be working with where I have more freedom when it comes to color schemes, especially in terms of painting skin. Like here, I really enjoyed painting this purplish, sick shade of human-like skin. So that's what I enjoy about those twisted miniatures. So I think at this point I will start focusing on metallics. I would say that I'm midway through towards finishing this miniature. So if you stick around or drop by closer to the end or stick around and observe me paint, then you will be able to see the final effect or close to final effect, because I won't be spraying it with varnish tonight. Don't want to sleep because I have my painting set up in the bedroom, so I don't want to sleep with the smell of varnish in the air. Not the healthiest thing to do. So now I'm using Cygor Brown, so it has very thin consistency, so it's easy to navigate this paint with brush. And I'm just marking the metal elements just to make sure they stand out before, and I'm going slightly beyond them just to make sure that there is some dark left over when I start highlighting it. I will put a bit more darker shade between his legs just to make sure that the material doesn't blend in together there. And I'm almost ready to start working on the metallics now. Okay, so let's grab some dark. I will paint it mainly gold, but no, it's not gold. This is golden and this is gold. So I'll be using again a color that I showed before, Glorious Gold from Vallejo. It's a very, very good gold color. And I may be tinting it because I want to have gold on his armor elements, but gold that will be quite different than his mask, so different shades. So I'll be using these two shades of gold from gold paint set from Andrea Color. Andrea has this nice idea of producing paints in boxes of six, where you get six shades. For example, I have a box with 6 shades of red, 6 shades of brown, 6 shades of black, and then you don't need to mix paints, you just apply those as you go. But for base coat, I'll be using rough iron from War Paints. Now, since this has pretty good consistency but not great coverage, I will just apply a little bit of it on the palette, and then just to make sure that the coverage is good, I will go over it. I will just add some Psycho Brown, like a big dot of it. So putting it next to the paint, I'm not sure you can see it because it's quite dark, but this will help with the flow of the paint. It will keep it a bit darker, and that way I will have solid, dark, brass-like color for the base coat, and I will gradually highlight it using gold. Because Lucius, even if he goes out in the street, get his hands dirty, he still looks fancy. So his armor was still fancy gold rather than plain dull metal. I think that just stays with the character. Because his first version, I think his first 3 versions, I believe that he's had 3 iterations of his persona, and they were all super elegant, wearing fancy clothes. So this one is a bit different, but still the fancy element is there. So the wrist protectors, it doesn't probably show that well in the video, but well, I think you can tell by the shine, right? The light reflects of metallic colors much stronger, so even on that level it's noticeable. If you don't see the huge difference in color because the base coat is dark brown, then you can at least notice the shine. And then this circle-like ornament here, and also some elements of the sword that he has, probably just for aesthetic look, because don't think in the card description there is any sword-like weapon. He just fights with his claws, which I didn't put much effort into highlighting because I will be adding some gore effects to them. So the sword handle, just being careful not to tint other elements that I want to keep white or blue. And now I'll be adding a bit of gold to the mix. As you can see, I still haven't even cleaned my brush. It still has some of this dark brass look. And now I'll mix it. So I have this dark gold, and it is a bit too dry. So I will add a tiny drop of, just a 1 drop of lime medium, because I don't want those flakes of metallics to separate too easily. And I can start highlighting the gold. The reason I go with, try to mix it because gold is quite tricky. It's easy to lose the careful work you've put into building the highlights gradually when you go from darker base coat to bright finish. And while it may be a decent effect for, let's say, heroic fantasy, here I want to have this darker, slower progression between base coat and final highlight. So I'm just taking my time, and again making sure I don't cover the whole element. Some of the Well, I put quite a lot of effort into making sure that I have this darker color as a base coat, so I don't want to make it disappear completely when I'm putting gradual highlights. So I'm taking my time, building it up slowly, but it's already quite noticeable. And again, if you have this gradual pattern of highlights, you can just go over the same surface and look at the elements which are more round, which are closer, and bring them up. And that way you don't need really to use 2 or 3 layers of paint in between. Just one, if it's thinned down properly and you apply it once or twice, and then you build this gradual transition from dark to bright. Okay, and I'm slowly finishing with the golden elements. Next stage will be to use pure glorious gold. I will need to be a bit more careful there and more selective about the areas that I want to have covered. And this circle-like ornament. The leather bolts, I think I will use those. I will use just silver there. But here I will use the same color, but I will keep this part a bit darker because I want to have 2, 3 different style of highlights of golden here. So I'm approaching each one slightly differently. Thank you. Impressive paint job. Glad you like it. Still not complete, but getting closer there. But as you can see already, there is quite the difference between the mask and the other golden elements. And I want to keep highlighting, but I don't want to change it too much. So pure gold. And now for it to be applied carefully, I will be using my dry brush. The brush that I use for dry brushing, which has very thick bristle, but it's still quite thin. So something like this. As you can see, it's rather thick, but it's not that huge, so I can still use it selectively. I will turn the tissue upside down because that side has just absorbed too much water. So as you can see, it's now, as the name of the paint says, glorious gold. So I will be just brushing it lightly on the front, not on the whole surface. And again, focusing on the areas which are more rounded and I try to visualize how those would reflect light. This paint is rather thick and it dries quickly, so no chance for taking my sweet time here. I just want to quickly land the highlights before I add a bit of silver to the mix, or maybe not silver, maybe I will do it in a slightly different way. Now I need to change the brush because those elements are just too fine, and if I dry brush over it, some of the paint will be visible, some of the gold will be visible on elements that I want to be anything but gold. So just again being mindful of leaving the middle darker and focusing on the areas closer to the edges, just to create a bit of contrast here. And the other, and again, and I've talked about it before, is that when I want to focus on really small section of miniature, if you look at closely at how I approach it, I start moving the brush before I even touch the surface, so that when the brush touches, when the tip of the brush touches the surface, I have a little bit more control over it. It's a thing of mine. I'm not sure if this is, I'm not saying this is the best way of painting fine details, but it works for me. It kind of puts me in the zone, right? I can really zoom in and focus on small area. And now I'm using it. I will use a diluted gold for a brief moment, very diluted, just to go over the elements in between, which are darker at this point, but they will still get this kind of decent shine if I use diluted golden over them. And now to make sure that I paint it in a slightly different way, I will use base gold from Andrea, because it's a different shade of gold. It's kind of like gold mixed with silver already. As you can see, not sure if you can see it, but if I try to bring it closer, it's got quite different shade than the one I used for previous highlight. So again, working my brush along the edges of the elements that make most sense to get highlight. So again, there is this thin line at the bottom. And as you can see, my brush is moving in slow, controlled way before I even touch the miniature. There is some gold on the shoe here, but I'll fix it shortly, so no worry there. I actually had some trouble deciding how to paint this lower section. I wasn't really clear on where the shoes begin and where the armor starts, but I had some help with wonderful Wyrd hobby assistant, so Kimberly gave me some pointers on what the author of the artwork had in mind there, and thanks to that I knew that this can be treated as metal. But why not paint it as a piece of cloth? I mean, It can be leather. I assume it would still make sense. So again, focusing on the edges. The left hand. And now before I apply final highlight with silver, which will be followed by a few glazes and washes, I will choose darker silver for the elements around the belt. And for that, I will just go with good old chainmail from Citadel. And I will grab a very small brush. And again, twirl it on the palette. Literally just tapping it on the surface. And after doing that, I will give it a bit of a wash. Why not with silicon gray? Because this will take the shine off, and then the final highlight with mithril silver, which is much brighter, will really pop nicely. And now I will use mithril silver. So the brightest shade of silver I currently have. Put a bit more of it on the palette. Dip just the tip of the brush in it and very selectively place it on the most prominent features, on just the most protruding sections. And this will be followed by some glazes. I'm not in a hurry here, just taking my time to make sure I use the miniature, that I take my time to just study the miniature and observe where the highlights should land. So now those silver elements, very lightly touching it, making sure I cover less surface than I did with the base coat. There it is. That's the kind of look I was aiming for. Again, rotating the miniature, trying to identify areas where I can add this extra punch of highlight. Now, metallics can be tricky because it's really easy to make them look flat and uninteresting. But it's also fairly easy to make them look decent with proper use of glazes and washes, which is what I plan to start doing in a second. Okay. And now for the golden elements, you can play with it in different way. There are different ways of making the gold look more vibrant. One way is to use yellow glazes. Green glazes can also do the trick. You can also use purple. I will use a bit of this and that. Just not to limit myself to just one. I will just get my yellow glaze. So diving under the desk, back again, and I will use Lamenter's yellow. And this will make the gold look a bit more vivid. I'm just testing it on the back. And it's all about modifying how bright or dark you want it to look. And I want it to look a bit brighter, so not flooding the whole surface of those golden elements with the glaze, but just using it rather selectively, because I will still use a different color in a second. I will use the purple wash now. And this one I will thin down with water. And I will apply it to the midsection here. And that way I will have this kind of gradient going from bright yellowish gold to a slightly purplish. And I think the purple tint here goes well with the fact that it's not a human creature after all, it's a never-born monster that we're looking at. So the transition should be visible here. And you can still pick it up a little bit, which is what I plan to do. Just making sure I grab a brush with a good tip, mix in some silver with gold so that it's not pure silver, and just enhance the overall look. Just tiny dots of this mixture of silver and gold on the very fine edges here. And I will again use this dotting technique just to make sure that the highlights here look like reflection of light more than gradual buildup of color. And I'm going to use more of purple on the sword handle just to keep it a bit darker. Okay. Yeah, it's getting closer to the finish stage, but still plenty of work to do with the base and the effects that I have in mind for it. So every now and then it's a good idea to just take the miniature and look at it from a bit of distance, kind of rotate it around, see if there are still elements that I would like to retouch. I'm more or less happy with what I have. I think the knee pads, the leather elements on the knees could use a bit more highlight. So I will use some leather brown from Reaper. I do like my Reaper paints. I've had them for a couple of years, and each time I will open them, I'm quite amazed that they hold up so well, because they don't dry. Those are some of the best paints, and they're not. I don't know if there is an European distribution for them. I think I bought them from the US a couple of years ago, just a few colors, but they've held up. So I'm just highlighting the pads here. And just making sure that I don't go too heavy on them. And then I can try to modify the surface a little bit. Let me just check one thing. So I will just use a little bit of the skeleton bone to place some fine highlights on the edges here. If I see that the tip of the brush is not ready, I just twirl it on the palette a little bit to make sure it's ready to touch the miniature. So there it is, the Dandy Assassin, and now onto the base. So the wood planks and the skulls. I think I will start with the wood, and I will just use slightly brighter shade. I can actually use this Reaper leather brown mixed with skeleton horde and a touch of yellow, maybe a touch of Nazareth yellow contrast paint, and just go along the lines of those planks and highlight them a little bit. So I have a color which is a mix between this light brown, bone white, and yellow. And this is just about taking your time to go along these lines that are already on the base. I mean, you can just dry brush them and then apply a glaze or a wash and it will still look good. I'll just take a bit more time before I dry brush to make sure that the color is solid. So it's like this yellowish, brownish mixture that looks quite pale, and I chose it on purpose just so that I create a little bit more of contrast between the base and the model that stands on top of it. And I need to remember that there are some nail heads sticking out here, so they will be treated with darker metallics in a second. So just taking my time, especially important along the edges. And as you can see, there are some nicely detailed lines here, but not on the side. So I'll try to kind of recreate them. Just to make sure that the highlights are staying aligned with roughly what's happening on the top of the base. Now I think I can go with it with a dry brush, but not too heavy dry brush. So I'm again using the skeleton bone paint. And dry brushing it, but doing it from the side. A little bit too much. I don't want my paint to be too dry. I want the color to catch well. Not an issue if I go over this grayish area because I want to highlight the sand here as well. And I will give it a wash in a second. As you can see, I'm just pressing the brush heavier on the edges. And while I still have the skeleton bone color on the palette, I will slightly water it down and highlight the skulls lying on the side. Two of them at the front, and I believe at least one protruding from below. There is also this rat, which I will tackle in a second. Okay, now while the paint is still not dry, I will blend it with brighter shade. So again, keeping that little bit of the previous color on the brush, mixing it and having very thin consistency. And here trying to be a bit more selective with highlights, so not going over the whole surface of the skull, just focusing on the area which should be more visible. So not covering the whole area, but just focusing on the more protruding section. And I might go there with a touch of pure white, just a light touch of white. That's more like it. And also, as you can see here, I don't like the fact that there is this plank going in a different direction, and there should be some kind of separation between those planks. So I will do that with Psycho Brown. Grab a very thin brush, remove the excess of paint. Maybe grab a smaller brush. This one is too thick. This one should do the job. It's 000 from Artis Opus. And just drag it along the section where these two planks connect. And then I create this kind of separation so that it's clearly visible that there are two separate planks. And I can actually use this to separate some lines here as well, because it's such a strong color. and defining the structure of the plank, of where one plank finishes and the other one is visible. This will add a bit of depth to the base. And I can also use it to go over the nail heads and let some of it flow into the eye socket. Nowadays, it's all about making sure that the depth between the element, the depth separating the elements is clearly marked. And I would say that this is the extra effort that you can take if you want to have this richer look. I'm not sure that's the best way to describe it, but I would say that those are some extra steps which are not necessary, but if you take them, the effect should be well worth it. Zombie Viruk, hey, nice to see you, mate. Finally. Good to see you around. You missed a little bit of action on this guy. Now I will saturate the planks with a little bit of wash, and I will use light tone. And I will just apply a fairly generous wash here. So we'll grab a slightly larger brush which can absorb more of the wash, and just apply it. Never again. No worries. Family, job, those are things that take precedence, and those are the priorities, right? Daily priorities. It's funny that I typically read bedtime story to my older daughter, and I typically put her to sleep at around, well, she falls asleep at around, let's say 8:30 p.m. And every time I have a stream, she struggles falling asleep. And I end up reading to her until she falls asleep late into the night, and typically finish right before the stream. The irony of things. Okay, now I will do the rat. And for that, I will just go ahead and start with pinkish shade of skin, because I want to make it visible. It's quite different color than what I have going on. And I will apply it directly, fully being aware that I will need at least 2 layers of paint here, because it won't be that clearly noticeable. But again, that's something that I've been stressing, and I may sound like a broken record, but if you apply the same bright shade, if you water it down slightly over the same surface, you will just create the smooth transition, the kind of gradient, which looks cool. And it's like a hobby hack, right? You just you don't put in that much work and you get really decent result. And I'm taking advantage of the fact that I still have some white on the palette. So mixing it with the pink that I started the rat with, and just going along the ear line, the skull of the rat basically, to put some highlights there. Now the tricky part is teeth, which are super duper tiny. So this will be a bit of a challenge, but let's see. We'll grab some off-white. And again, I'm moving my brush before I actually touch the surface. There is one teeth, there is the other one. Teeth number 3. How many teeth can a rat have? 4. And now going with this brighter shade of white. Teeth number 5 and 6. Wasn't that bad? I'll just highlight the teeth. Sounds like a masochistic pleasure. Really, highlighting the teeth is not my favorite part of the job because it's super tricky. It's so easy to ruin everything if you do this one final little touch and then you spoil everything. So now I will water down a little bit of glaze, put it over the teeth to make sure that they don't look healthy. Lay some of it on the rat in the middle of its upper part of the head, and then the eyes. The eyes will be red, so putting a little bit of red on the palette. And making sure I bring out the eyes. All right, there is one dot for one eye, one dot for the other eye. And now yellow and white. So highlighting the eyes for a change after highlighting the teeth. What can go wrong? So one thing to bear in mind when you work on fine details is to make sure that you have a good hold of the miniature, that your hand won't start shaking, because if you hold it in one hand, so make sure you support your wrists, that you hold the miniature handle with both hands. Makes things a bit easier, and you want to give yourself as much of an advantage as possible before you start tackling those tiny elements. All right, nailed it. That's one eye. There is the other eye. The paint is still pretty fresh, so no need for it to blending. Oh, you painted finish your one of those. So you painted finish sorry, been talking for too long. You've just finished painting your own Lucius unmasked. That's interesting. Or you mean a rat? And now we'll thin down just some red. Make sure it has very thin consistency. We'll test it on the sheet of paper and just apply it over the eye. I want to have it slightly more controlled so that it tints the area around it a little bit. That's it. So the skulls are ready. Now time for the nails. So again, I will use chainmail as a base coat. Well, it's already base coat that outlined in dark brown. So I will just make sure I go lightly over the surface. And pick up all the nail heads from the floor. This is all of them, I think. And now time for some wash with Basilicum Gray. And again, I will apply it over the nails and then use a brighter shade of silver to make those more noticeable. I might, while I'm at it, I will just give a quick wash of gray to the boots. Maybe a bit more to the side of the skull. And at this point, I'm noticing a little bit of base coats showing through in some small areas. So making sure I give it some proper treatment of darker color so that it doesn't show through. Again, no mistakes, happy little accidents that can be easily fixed. And time for highlight with pure mithril silver. Taking it straight from the pot doesn't need watering down. In fact, you want to be careful with watering down metallics because it's so easy to break the structure of the paint. And very lightly making sure I don't touch the whole surface of the nail head, just one edge to make sure I pick it out, because otherwise these lose the three-dimensional look. They will look flat and uninteresting. And while I have silver, I may add a dot here or there just to put a bit more of structure. Maybe a few dots along the side here. Well, I've overdone a little bit, so while the paint isn't dry, I will just remove the excess. Now the pants they still require a bit more work, so I will grab brighter shade. And place a few highlights still on them. Just trying to imitate a little bit of the texture of the material that would be normally visible. And now I will, while the base is drying, I will do two more things. They will both be quite impactful. And just to show you what I have in mind at this stage, I will use Yenza for reference. As you can see, the lower sections of the base of her robes, they look like they're dirty. And this is something that can be achieved with dry pigments. It's not very complex, but it's highly effective if you want to get this dirty look on material. So it looks super fancy, but it's not really challenging to do. But also, maybe before I do that, I will also add some gore effect on the hand, because he's the guy that fights with his claws. So I'm grabbing a piece of sponge, giving it a good mix, and I'm using blood for the blood god, dipping it slightly, and now tapping it. As you can see, it gradually starts leaving less on the piece of paper, and I will just gently tap it on the fingers. And I will do it before varnishing. It may lose the shine, but if it loses the shine, I will then reapply it selectively, because I don't want to lose the work that to ruin the work that I've put into having this nice purplish shade of skin here. And since his hands are blooded, why don't I actually put some of the blood splatter on his robes, and maybe a little bit on the base as well? Okay. One thing I also noticed that I will fix quickly now is the transition between the metal elements and the rest of the model. This requires a bit of a quick fix. So using dark contrast, I will work on putting a thin line here, and as you can see again, small controlled movements before I even touch the miniature. To create this kind of line separating these two elements. Because I thought that it's not clearly indicated. And I just want to make sure it's better visible. Also thin line below the armpit. And as well, I think here it blends too much, this yellowish edge with the white. Yeah, that's more like it. So now you can see the blood splatter on the hand and some of it on the material. And hopefully from this angle you can see the effort put into making sure that the gold does not look two-dimensional. And now for this, I'm nearing the final stage, so I will remove the... And just to give you perspective, those are just the paints used for, well, not all of the paints, those are just some of the paints that I've used today. So not that many actually, come to think of it, but still quite a few. So I will also put some of the dirt effects. Maybe I will also do a little bit of blood splatter on his trousers, just on the front, because you can imagine that his legs were moving as the blood was dripping from his hand. And we want to have it kind of in this, limited to this section. He looks so innocent, doesn't he? And now let me dive in and grab the dry pigments. So I will use 2 of those. And for this section, for this part of work, I will just take him off my very professional handle. Just making sure I remove all the blue tack, because if I keep it, the rim of the base won't stay black. I won't be able to paint it because it's a bit greasy. So I want to make sure I use a piece of blue tack to remove the remaining bits of blue tack. And at the bottom, I place a magnet. So first, prior to painting, I drill the hole. And I think I mentioned it before, but the reason I do it is because I keep my miniatures in metal transporter. So if I have a piece of magnet glued, if I have a small magnet glued to the base, it just never falls off. So it's by far the best protection you can have for your miniatures. And now I will prepare space for working with dry pigments. I'll just lay out tissue. And the blood splatters, as I mentioned, this is something that I would typically do after applying matte varnish, but I wanted to show you guys how I approach it. I may need to reapply some blood to make sure it looks glossy, because that's one element that I want to stay glossy. So those are the products that I mentioned. So Vallejo pigments, I will be using brown iron oxide, maybe dark yellow ochre as well, but dark brown should be fine. And this is really interesting to look inside. This is like brown powder, so quite different. And actually, if you mix it with water, it has very, very strong pigment. So just to give you an idea, I dabbed, well, how you apply it. First of all, maybe before, no, I will start by applying it on the miniature. So I put it, some of it in the cover. It's got very strong pigment. And then I choose the areas which I want to be affected by it. So let's say his shoes, and I just try to put some of it on his shoes or boots, whatever those are, some of it on the armor. And as you can see, it already creates this nice dirt effect. I will put some of it on the trousers very selectively. And then I would assume that his coat can get dirty. One thing to avoid is when you apply dry pigments, don't make sure that you don't put it just in one line. I will put it in a way that looks bad, just to give you an idea before I fix it. So look here, we have this. It looks great on the miniature, but it looks very unnatural when it's so evenly spread. So make sure some of it goes to the upper part, some of it stays at the bottom, just so that it's spread unevenly. Because otherwise it gets this very awkward look. This is not how how dirt collects on clothes in general. Now, this is the first part where you just put it on a miniature. And at this point, you can pretty much already spray over it with varnish if you use varnish and spray. But I choose to use something that's called pigment fixer. It's basically turpentine. So it's not odorless, but it doesn't have strong smell. And I make sure I grab a brush which is clean. It doesn't have to be a good brush. So I'm using my very old dirty brush. Hey, cool, Curses. Good to. What's your Instagram account? You can let us know. I'll make sure to check it out and give you a follow. Interesting to see people tackling newly released models. Now, what I want to do is I make sure that the brush is wet with the pigment fixer, and I touch the miniature and let it basically flow. As you can see, it just I lightly touch the miniature, which is covered in this powder, and it pretty much works by itself. So what you don't want to do is that you don't want to touch directly the area at the bottom. Just touch area slightly above it, and it comes down on its own. See how it... And the area which is touched by pigment fixer will keep the pigment, the dry pigment, on the miniature, which is what we want. We don't want it to flake off. It looks a bit messy, but once dry, the pigment will bear, and that's an easy and effective way of creating dirt effects. Now make sure you close everything properly, and while we still have a couple of minutes to go, I will do the swamp effect. I mean, the swamp effect, it's too much to say, but I mentioned earlier that my Neverborn are swamp themed, and the swampy bases are my go-to style for base coating them, for basing them. So what I will do now, first of all, fold it so that I don't have dry pigment all over my workspace. seems like there is some kind of delay between what I do and what is visible on the video. So I'm using now Vallejo water texture effects. You can get it as Vallejo still water. Anyway, as long as it's got, I think other companies produce it as well, but it's for making water texture effects. So I will apply some of it onto my mixing pot, which is a 30 millimeter Wyrd base. And then I will add a bit of dark green wash. A few drops. Well, what's good about it is that it's super glossy when it dries. So perfect for swamp effects, for water effects, where you want to clearly mark which elements are those that are covered with water. So mixing it with green wash means that I will be taking away the shine. So once it dries, and I will do it most likely tomorrow, maybe in the morning, once it is dry, I will make sure to go over it once more with still water, but not mixed with anything. And this will flow into all the recesses, and I will use it over those elements that are like sand, and this will also tint them nicely. And now to give a little bit of variety, I will also use Nurgle's Rot. Just put some of it on the palette, using still the brush which I used for the initial color, and just apply a few patches of it here and there. And now his shoes are not only dirty, but covered with mud. Poor Lucius. Sure, he's not feeling comfortable being dirty. But this comes with the territory. When you leave the manor and you go out in the street, that's what you get. So I covered the little ratty head with a bit of that mix, so I'm cleaning it up now. And as you can see, the base is now, we have some blood splatter. So my goal here was to show a few ways of putting different types of effects. So hopefully you can now see how these combine. So once again, reapplying a little bit of brighter color with Nurgle Rot. So he is now clearly walking on some old partly rotted away wooden planks, which goes in theme with the basing theme I have for my Neverborn. So now the only remaining steps that I have for Lucius Unmasked is to, first of all, is to wait for the camera to get clear view of the model. All right, there we go. So the only remaining things that I want to do is to paint the rim of the base with pure black. And as you can see, this dirt effect on the cloak has already dried. And actually, I may add a quick touch of different color there. I will use a tiny bit of dark yellow ochre, just a little bit of it, to add a bit more depth to the cloak. So once again, just using dry pigment, very lightly touching just the very edge. The same with the front, some of it on the shoes. The blood splatters there, so some texture. Okay, now you should be able to see quite clearly. So this is the miniature that I started painting in the last stream. So altogether, give or take 4.5 hours of work. And my idea was to show you quite quick and effective way of working with one base coat. Basically, that's what I did for the cloak and for the vest, because I used blue and just added different mixes to that. Then doing quick and effective leather, working on some metallics, doing this kind of pseudo glow effect on the eyes, then paying attention to using different saturation if you have the same color in a few places, like gold on the armor and gold on the mask. And my intention was to keep the variety there. And also having this kind of general composition idea. Like here I had this idea that the upper part will be brighter, the lower will be darker, and I wanted something to hold it together or add a little bit of eye-catching contrast in the middle. That's why I opted for this red patches. And the base, which I know that the sides look bad when they are white, but I will make sure that they are finished off with black paint tomorrow. So I think that within 24 hours I should be posting pictures of finished model on Discord, on the Wyrd forums, so you will be able to see the final effect there with some decent pictures. And also, and here's the little rat. And also for my next stream, as promised, I will make a poll and let you guys decide what I paint next. It will be something either from Explorers or the new Nexus, the Emissary model, or maybe something from Guild, maybe something from Neverborn, maybe the Neverborn, the Mysterious Emissary. I'll let you decide. I will put a few ideas. So thank you, Kimberly, for reminding about my Instagram profile. It's been great painting alongside with you guys watching. Thanks for the comments along the way. And make sure you check out the next streams coming up shortly. So stay connected to the Wyrd social media channels. So for tonight, for today, it's a wrap from me. Thank you guys. Take care, everyone. Have a good rest of the day and see you on the next stream.